The air was thick with tension as the plane cruised through the clouds, but for one man, it was just another flight. He settled into his seat, barely glancing at the woman sitting next to him, his eyes glued to the screen in front of him. But what he didn't know was that this flight would soon become a pivotal moment in his life, one that he would regret for the rest of his days. It started innocently enough. A woman in her mid-30s quietly made her way to her seat, carefully placing her bag in the overhead compartment. She seemed to be in a rush, but there was nothing out of the ordinary about her appearance or behavior. The man, who was already comfortably settled in his seat, barely noticed her as she sat down beside him. He was too absorbed in his own world, his phone, his plans for the weekend, and the thoughts swirling in his head about his upcoming business meeting. What he didn't realize was that the woman sitting next to him would soon become the center of his attention, whether he wanted her to be or not. From the very first moment, the man's actions were careless, but they escalated quickly. He sighed loudly as the woman fidgeted in her seat, adjusting her position just a little too much for his liking. "Can't you sit still?" he muttered under his breath, his tone sharp and impatient. The woman, trying to keep her composure, didn't respond, but he kept glancing at her, his frustration growing with every slight movement she made. It was as if he couldn't tolerate her presence next to him. The tension in the air grew palpable. The woman, who had initially been polite and cordial, began to notice the man's increasingly rude demeanor. He wasn't trying to hide his irritation, and it became clear to her that he didn't want her sitting beside him. Yet, despite his obvious discomfort, he continued to make small, sarcastic remarks, his words dripping with condescension. "Don't you know how to use an armrest?" he asked loudly, his voice carrying through the cabin, earning a few uncomfortable glances from nearby passengers. But what the man didn't realize, what he couldn't have known, was that this was no ordinary passenger. This woman wasn't just anyone. She wasn't someone who would let these subtle insults slide without a response. She had a history, a life, and a career that made her stronger than he could ever imagine. She didn't just have a seat on the plane, she had a place in the world, and a purpose that would soon teach this man a very important lesson. As the man continued to make crude comments, he could sense a shift in the woman's demeanor. She didn't look angry, at least not in the way he might have expected. Instead, she seemed calm, eerily calm. But there was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Was it disdain? Was it power? Whatever it was, it unsettled him. He leaned back in his seat, convinced that the woman was just an inconvenience in his journey, another passenger who didn't understand basic airplane etiquette. He even rolled his eyes when she asked the flight attendant for a glass of water, as if her simple request was too much to bear. Little did he know, his careless words were about to come back to haunt him in a way that he would never forget. The moment the plane landed, he stood up, ready to stretch his legs and get off as quickly as possible. He was done with this flight, done with the rude woman who had spoiled his peaceful journey. But as he turned to grab his bag from the overhead compartment, something stopped him cold. Standing right behind him was someone he never expected to see, not just anyone, but someone whose name would change the course of his life forever. And at that moment, everything he thought he knew about the situation, about the woman sitting next to him, came crashing down. The man, still processing what was happening, tried to maintain his composure, but the reality hit him like a punch in the gut. The woman who had quietly endured his insults, the woman he had treated with so little respect, wasn't just some random passenger. She was someone powerful, someone whose presence would leave a mark on him that he would never forget. As the flight attendants moved swiftly through the cabin, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The man's face went pale as he realized that the woman he had humiliated was someone far more important than he could have ever imagined. And the worst part, he had no idea what kind of consequences awaited him. Was he about to lose his job, his reputation, or was this something much more personal, something that would haunt him far beyond this flight? But before he could fully comprehend what was happening, the woman turned to him, her expression calm, but her words sharp. "You should be more careful about how you treat people," she said quietly, her voice steady. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that he couldn't ignore. And just as quickly as the moment came, it was gone. The woman walked past him, her steps unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. But for the man, time had stopped. He was left standing there, stunned and uncertain, realizing too late that he had crossed a line he couldn't take back. Now, as the man stood there in disbelief, the truth began to sink in. The next part of the story was something he couldn't possibly have predicted. The consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. Would he ever be able to make amends? Or would he be forced to live with the weight of his humiliating mistake for the rest of his life? Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. As the woman walked past him, her heels clicking softly against the floor, the man couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in the pit of his stomach. He watched her, almost in slow motion, as she moved toward the exit of the plane. Her composure, her calmness in the face of his rude behavior, left him with a nagging sense that there was something more to her than just a fellow passenger. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the details of their brief encounter. He hadn't meant to be so harsh, but the way she had been moving around in her seat, the constant shifting, it had made him uncomfortable. It had disrupted his sense of space, of control. He wasn't one to be inconvenienced easily, especially when it came to something as trivial as a flight. But there was something about her, something that didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way she didn't react to his jabs, or how she had simply remained silent. It was almost as if she didn't care at all. It was a power dynamic he wasn't used to, and it unsettled him. But that unease quickly morphed into something worse as he began to notice the subtle whispers and glances from the other passengers. It was as though they were all aware of something he wasn't. A few of them exchanged knowing looks, and one woman gave him a sympathetic but slightly pitying stare. He brushed it off, thinking it was nothing more than the aftermath of an uncomfortable situation. Maybe he had misread the woman's reaction. Maybe she was used to people like him, used to being disrespected. But as his gaze returned to her retreating figure, something clicked. He recognized the way she walked, the confidence in her stride. It was the kind of poise he had seen in the most successful people he had encountered. The kind of person who didn't need to make a scene to get respect because they already had it. As the plane continued to taxi toward the gate, the man was left in a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He kept replaying the moments in his head, the way he had spoken to her, the way she had handled herself. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't place her. He had seen her somewhere before, but the name, the face, just wouldn't come to him. The recognition was just out of reach, like a puzzle missing one crucial piece. He looked around at the passengers who were now standing, collecting their belongings. Some of them seemed too distracted by their own thoughts to notice him, but others still glanced his way with subtle expressions that he couldn't quite decipher. He felt like a character in a bad movie, the one who had messed up, but didn't realize the true consequences until it was too late. He had been so wrapped up in his own frustrations, so caught up in his little bubble of entitlement, that he hadn't considered who he was dealing with. The woman was nearly out of the cabin now, and he found himself straining to catch one last glimpse of her. As he reached for his bag, he caught sight of the flight attendant, who gave him a quick, polite smile. It was the kind of smile that felt a little too forced, a little too rehearsed. "Thank you for flying with us, sir," she said, her voice soft but professional. "I hope you have a pleasant day." He nodded, barely registering her words. His mind was still on the woman. The mystery woman. Who was she? Why did she seem so familiar, yet so distant? There was no denying it now. He was hooked, and he had to know more. But how? He had no way of tracking her down on the plane. He didn't even know her name. For all he knew, she could have been some random stranger who would disappear into the crowd and never cross his path again. But something told him that wasn't the case. This wasn't a situation that would fade into the background. This was something that would follow him. He stepped off the plane, walking through the jet bridge with a sense of urgency. His mind was still spinning, but the crowd ahead of him had cleared, and there she was again, standing just outside the jetway, talking with someone. At first, he thought it was a coincidence, just another person in the crowd. But as he drew closer, he realized he couldn't have been more wrong. The woman wasn't talking to just anyone. She was engaged in a conversation with a man who looked, for lack of a better term, important. The man was tall, well-dressed, and his body language screamed power. He stood a few inches taller than her, but the way they interacted suggested that she was in no way inferior to him. The conversation was brief but intense. The woman spoke with a kind of confidence that made it clear she wasn't afraid to assert herself. The man, on the other hand, seemed to listen intently, nodding every so often, but not speaking much. There was an unspoken respect between them, and the man couldn't help but notice the way the woman's presence seemed to command the space around her. Suddenly, the pieces began to click into place. This wasn't just a random passenger. This wasn't just a woman traveling for business or leisure. She was someone with influence, someone with connections. As the woman and the man parted ways, the woman turned to leave, but before she disappeared into the crowd, she gave the man one final glance. It wasn't a glare, nor was it particularly harsh. It was simply a look, one that made his heart race and his stomach turn. He was certain she knew exactly who he was, what he had done, and she hadn't forgotten. The feeling that had been gnawing at him ever since they had exchanged words on the plane suddenly intensified. He had underestimated her. Underestimated what she could do, who she could be. He had assumed that his small acts of rudeness wouldn't matter, that he could go about his day without facing any real consequences. But he had been wrong. So very wrong. Now, standing in the bustling terminal, watching her walk away, he felt a chill creep down his spine. What had he gotten himself into? As the realization hit him, his mind raced to make sense of the situation. Who was she really? Was she just a woman with a powerful connection, or was there more to her story than he could possibly imagine? He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down, but every step he took toward the baggage claim felt heavier than the last. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and the only thing he could think about was how this simple, seemingly insignificant encounter had already begun to change his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. The suspense of it all, the mystery surrounding her identity, left him on edge. He needed answers, desperately. And yet, there was a nagging voice in the back of his mind that told him that some things were better left unknown. As he continued to walk toward baggage claim, the man's thoughts were spiraling, but none of them brought him any closer to understanding what had just happened. His mind kept returning to the woman, the way she had carried herself, how unaffected she seemed by his insults, and most importantly, how she had left the cabin so easily, like she wasn't fazed at all. He couldn't shake the image of her calm demeanor, her quiet power. His eyes drifted toward the terminal windows, looking out over the runway, but his mind wasn't on the planes or the busy passengers. It was consumed by her, the woman he had humiliated without even realizing who she was. The nagging feeling in his gut intensified as he thought back to that final glance she had given him, the look that said everything without saying a word. It was a warning. Or maybe it was something far worse. Maybe it was a promise that this encounter wouldn't just fade away, like so many others did. He had been so wrapped up in himself, in his own little world, that he hadn't even considered who he was dealing with. She wasn't just some stranger. There was a presence about her, a sense of something larger than the moment. It wasn't just about the plane ride, it was something more. He had crossed a line with her, and he had no idea how deep that line ran. As he reached the baggage claim, he noticed the same flight attendant who had smiled at him earlier. She was chatting with a few other passengers, but her eyes flickered toward him as he approached. For a moment, he thought he saw something, just a flash of something in her expression, but it was gone too quickly for him to understand. She didn't approach him, but he felt her gaze on him, as if she knew something he didn't. His bag finally appeared on the carousel, and he grabbed it, not bothering to check for his phone or wallet as he usually did. He needed to get out of here, to process the whirlwind of confusion swirling in his head. But as he walked toward the exit, the tension inside him didn't ease. If anything, it was getting worse. He couldn't shake the image of the woman from the plane. The more he tried to forget it, the more the memory clung to him like a shadow. He needed answers, but where could he find them? He didn't know where to start, or even if he should. As he stepped out of the airport into the crisp evening air, he spotted his car in the parking lot, waiting for him like it always did. He made his way toward it mechanically, his thoughts still scattered. But just as he was about to unlock the door, he heard a voice call his name. "Excuse me, sir." He turned quickly, his heart racing, expecting to see someone he knew. But instead, it was the same flight attendant. She was standing a few feet away, her hands clasped together in front of her, as if she was hesitant to approach him. She had the same polite smile from earlier, but now it looked different, more concerned, less professional. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her tone gentle but edged with something he couldn't place. He blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" The attendant glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the surroundings before she took a small step closer. "You were on a flight, right?" She hesitated. "With a woman who—" He didn't let her finish. "I don't know what you mean," he said quickly, his voice a little sharper than he intended. His nerves were getting the better of him. The attendant seemed to sense his unease, but she didn't back down. Instead, she looked him directly in the eye. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, but she's not someone you want to make an enemy of. Trust me." The words hit him harder than anything else that had happened that day. His heart skipped a beat, and for a split second, he wondered if he was hearing things. But her expression was serious. She wasn't joking. "Who is she?" he asked before he could stop himself. The attendant didn't immediately respond. She seemed to weigh her words carefully, glancing around one more time before speaking in a lower voice. "I can't say too much, but I'd be careful about your next steps. You wouldn't want her to notice you again." The words were cryptic, and the more the man tried to understand them, the less clear they became. Was she warning him? Threatening him? He didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. There was something much bigger going on than he had realized. The woman from the plane wasn't just an ordinary person. She had power, influence, something that the flight attendant had all but confirmed. And somehow, he had found himself in the middle of it. He'd opened his mouth to ask more questions, but before he could speak, the attendant gave him a brief, almost apologetic smile. "You're lucky I even said anything. You'll figure it out soon enough." Then, without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of passengers streaming out of the terminal. The man stood there for a long moment, staring after her, his mind racing. What had just happened? Who was the woman? Why was the flight attendant so concerned? What had he gotten himself into? His hands tightened around the car keys in his pocket, but he didn't feel like driving. He wasn't ready to face whatever was coming next, and yet, deep down, he knew that there was no avoiding it. This wasn't over, far from it. As he stood there, frozen in place, the shadows of doubt crept in. The situation was slipping further and further from his grasp, and every answer only seemed to raise more questions. The more he thought about the woman, the more his mind swirled with possibilities, dangerous possibilities. He had a feeling that this was only the beginning. Something had been set in motion that day on that flight, something that had far-reaching consequences. The woman wasn't just someone who could ruin his reputation or his career. There was a depth to her, a level of influence that scared him. But what terrified him most was that he didn't know if he could get out of this mess now, even if he wanted to. The whole world felt out of his control, and the weight of his own ignorance was suffocating. The more he tried to push it out of his mind, the more the tension built, and the more he realized that he would never be able to forget her. The days that followed felt like an unrelenting spiral into uncertainty. The man couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he was being watched, that every move he made was under someone's gaze. He tried to go about his usual routine, work, meetings, quick dinners, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every time he stepped outside, he felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if someone was right behind him, just out of view. He thought about the woman constantly, her face her calm, collected manner. The way she had handled him, like his words didn't matter, like she knew something he didn't. And now the flight attendant's cryptic warning played over and over in his mind. You wouldn't want her to notice you again. He tried to dismiss it, but deep down, he couldn't shake the suspicion that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't control. There was too much he didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him, day after day. His usual confidence faltered, replaced with an eerie sense of dread. Was it just paranoia? Or was there a real threat looming over him, one that he had no way of understanding? Then, one morning, he received a message, a text, from an unknown number. The message was simple, but it sent a chill through his entire body. Asterisk, we need to talk. You know where to find me. Asterisk. His hands shook as he read the words again, trying to make sense of it. He had no idea who it was from, but the tone, the directness, it felt unmistakably like the woman from the plane. His heart raced as he glanced at the time. He had no idea how much time had passed since he first saw her, but he knew now that this wasn't going to just blow over. The message felt like the first domino falling in a chain of events he wasn't prepared for. For hours he debated what to do. Should he ignore it? Should he go to the authorities? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that no matter what, his next move was crucial. He didn't know who she was, or who was behind her, but he could sense that there were people involved with more power than he could comprehend. His mind raced with possibilities. Was this a scam? A setup? Maybe someone was trying to intimidate him into doing something. But what could they want? What did he have that was worth threatening him for? With a deep breath, he decided to act. His curiosity and the constant gnawing feeling that he was being dragged into something bigger than he could handle pushed him to reply. Asterisk where? Asterisk. The response was immediate. Asterisk meet me at the old pier by the docks. 7 p.m. asterisk. There was no name, no further explanation, just an address. It felt wrong from the moment he typed out his response, but something in his gut told him he had no choice but to go. He had to see it through, to uncover whatever was lurking behind the unsettling series of events that had begun with a single dismissive comment on a plane ride. As evening fell, he drove to the docks, his palms sweating against the steering wheel, his thoughts racing. The sky had turned an ominous shade of purple, the streets around him dark and nearly empty. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following him. But the road behind him was empty, save for the occasional car passing by. He tried to calm himself, but the tension in the air felt almost suffocating. When he reached the old pier, he parked the car a few hundred feet away and stepped out, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the cracked pavement. The place was desolate, quiet, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty lot. He looked around, scanning the area for any sign of her. There was no one in sight. Then, in the distance, he saw movement. A figure emerged from the shows, walking slowly toward him. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized her immediately. The woman, the one he had insulted on the plane. She was alone, but there was no mistaking the air of authority she carried with her. She walked with a slow, deliberate grace, as though she were perfectly comfortable in this eerie, isolated setting. He stood frozen, unsure whether to approach or retreat. When she reached him, she stopped just a few feet away. Her expression was calm, unreadable, like she had been expecting him all along. "You came," she said, her voice almost detached. His words caught in his throat for a moment, but he finally managed to speak. "What is this? What do you want from me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied him with a calm, almost calculating gaze. "I don't want anything from you," she replied, her voice smooth. "But you have something I need." His pulse quickened. "What's that supposed to mean?" She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't think you realize who you're dealing with. Not yet." A cold shiver ran down his spine as he tried to make sense of her words. "Who are you?" She smiled, a faint, knowing smile that sent a wave of unease through him. "Let's just say that I'm someone who's been watching you, watching your every move." His breath caught in his chest. "Watching me. You thought you could just get away with it," she continued, her tone almost amused. "With your careless words, your attitude. You didn't think there would be consequences, did you?" The weight of her words hit him harder than any threat. He had been so sure that nothing would come of his behavior, that it was just an isolated incident. But now, standing face to face with her, everything felt different. The sense of danger was palpable, and he realized just how deep he had dug himself into a hole. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the fear creeping in. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Because it's time for you to understand that actions have consequences. You don't get to treat people like they don't matter, like they're just there to serve your needs. Not anymore." For the first time, the man felt truly afraid. He had made a mistake, one that he couldn't take back, and now it seemed that the woman was going to make him pay for it. But how far would she go? What was she really capable of? As the wind picked up, sending a chill through the air, he realized that whatever was coming next, he wasn't prepared for it. The tension was unbearable, each passing second stretching longer than the last. He was in too deep now, and the only thing he could do was wait for the storm to hit. The woman's eyes never wavered from his as she continued to speak, her words cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. Each one felt like an accusation, each one tightening the noose around his neck. But just as the tension seemed to peak, something unexpected happened. A car engine rolled in the distance, its headlights cutting through the dark, distant streets. At first, he didn't think much of it, just another vehicle passing through the deserted area. But then the sound grew louder, and the headlights came closer, too close. He instinctively turned his head, a sense of dread rising in him as he saw the vehicle heading directly toward them. The woman's expression didn't change. She simply watched the car approach with an eerie calmness, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. As the car pulled up to a stop in front of them, the man's eyes widened. Two figures stepped out of the vehicle, both of them dressed in dark suits, their faces hidden in shadow. The air around them seemed to grow colder, and the man could feel his pulse quicken in his chest. Something was happening here, something he wasn't prepared for. One of the figures, taller and broader than the other, stepped forward. He didn't speak immediately, but his presence was enough to send a wave of unease through the man. The woman, still standing motionless, turned her gaze toward the new arrivals, her eyes flickering with something like approval. "So, this is the one." The man in the suit finally spoke. His voice was low and measured, but there was a sharp edge to it. He wasn't asking a question, he was making a statement. "Yes," the woman replied simply. The taller man stepped closer to the man, who was now frozen, unable to move. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny on him, and it made his stomach churn. "You've made quite an impression," the figure said, his voice sending a shiver down the man's spine. "But you're not who you think you are." The words didn't immediately register. The man's mind was still spinning, trying to understand what was happening. Who were these people? What were they talking about? Before he could speak, the second figure, shorter and more compact, spoke up. "You've been watched for a long time," they said, then a voice quieter but no less intense. "You don't realize how deep this goes." His breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" he finally managed, his voice shaky. The woman smiled again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the calm, calculating smile he had seen earlier. It was one of revelation, of something he hadn't known. "You've been a part of something much bigger than you realize," she said softly. "And now you're in it, whether you like it or not." A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His mind was striving to keep up, but one thing was certain. This was no longer just about him and the woman on the plane. There was a hidden world here, a network of people he had somehow stumbled into, and now they were all closing in on him. The tall man spoke again, his voice laced with authority. "The truth is, we've been watching you for months. All the way back to that flight. You didn't just disrespect her. You made a mistake. A very dangerous mistake. The man felt a rush of panic. What are you talking about? He managed to choke out. Who are you people? The tall figure stepped closer, his dark eyes narrowing. We're not the people you should be worried about. The people you've offended, the ones you've angered, they're the real threat. The words felt like a punch to the gut. He was no longer just dealing with one woman. He was being swept into something far larger than his own petty actions could have caused. There were others, powerful people, and now he was tangled in a web he had no way of escaping. The shorter figure turned to the woman, speaking in a low voice. Should we tell him now? The woman paused, considering, then nodded. It's time. The tall man turned back to the man. You still don't understand, do you? You're in the middle of a conflict that's been brewing for years. A conflict between those who hold power in the shadows and those who would tear it down. His eyes darkened. You're a pawn in a game you didn't even know existed, and now you've become a target. The man's mind was racing. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This had gone from a simple encounter with a stranger to a tangled web of deceit, power, and dangerous people. He had thought his rudeness was the only thing that had set this all in motion, but now he understood. He had triggered something much deeper. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and confusion. The woman stepped forward, her eyes locked onto his. We don't want anything from you. Not directly, anyway. But your actions have consequences, and we intend to make sure you understand them fully. The tall man chuckled darkly. You've seen just the tip of the iceberg, but the truth is, the people we answer to, well, they don't appreciate being disrespected. He swallowed hard, the weight of their words sinking in. Whoever these people were, they were not to be underestimated, and he was right in the middle of it, with no way out. He had crossed a line, and the consequences of that were rapidly becoming clearer. Suddenly, the woman stepped back, her gaze sharp and focused. Your life, your choices from here on out, they belong to us. We're not here to kill you, not yet, but you'll wish you hadn't crossed us before this is over. With that, the tall figure nodded at the car, signaling for the others to return. We'll be in touch. And trust me, you'll regret it if you don't play along. The woman gave him one final look, a mix of pity and menace in her eyes. Consider this your last warning. From here on out, everything changes. As they turned and walked away, the man stood frozen, his body trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had shifted. He was no longer in control of his own life. He was caught in a web of shadowy figures, and it was only a matter of time before he found out just how deep the darkness really went. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty and fear. The man couldn't shake the feeling that he was constantly being watched. Every phone call, every message seemed to come from somewhere he didn't understand, and each time he looked over his shoulder, he expected to see one of them there, the tall man, the woman, the people who had warned him about the consequences of his actions. Despite all of this, he tried to go about his life, pretending that things could return to normal, even though deep down he knew that was impossible. The weight of what had happened, and what was still hanging over him, was too heavy. But he couldn't ignore the one thing that still gnawed at him, the truth of what they had said. Who were these people, really? What had he become a part of? And why had they singled him out? Then the message came. It was late one night, a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, meet us at the warehouse. Midnight. We have answers. Asterisk. For a moment he hesitated. Was this another trap? Another game they were playing with him? But the curiosity and the need for answers finally pushed him to respond. He had to know. He couldn't go on living in the dark, not knowing who these people were and why they had targeted him. He drove to the warehouse that night, the same sense of dread hanging over him like a dark cloud. The place was even more deserted than before. There were no streetlights, no sounds of life, just an abandoned industrial area, silent except for the occasional gust of wind rattling through the broken windows. He parked his car a distance away, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped out into the night air. This time, there was no one waiting outside, no tall figure, no woman, just the dark, empty warehouse standing in front of him. He walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing off the concrete as he pushed it open. Inside, the space was vast and cold, the shadows deep and threatening. He wasn't alone for long. The woman appeared from the darkness, stepping into the faint light. Her expression was unreadable, and there was something in the way she moved that made his stomach drop. She wasn't alone this time, though. The tall man and the shorter figure were with her, standing in the shadows, their eyes trained on him. The moment he stepped inside, they surrounded him. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice hoarse with a mix of fear and frustration. "What do you want from me? I've done everything you've asked." The woman didn't speak at first. She only studied him, her gaze steady and calculating. Finally, she spoke. "You think this is about you, don't you?" He froze, not sure where she was going with this. "What do you mean?" "You've been a pawn in a much larger game," she said, her voice cold. "A game you didn't even know existed. You've been watched, manipulated, because someone knew you would crack. Someone knew you'd make a mistake, and that mistake would put you right here, right where we need you." His confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" The tall man finally stepped forward, his expression grim. "You weren't just any target. You were chosen. There's a reason why you were singled out. It's not random, and it's not about what you did on that plane. It's about what you can do. You're more important than you realize." Before he could process what they were saying, the shorter figure spoke up, a small smirk playing at the corners of their lips. "But the real question is, did you ever think to ask who you're really dealing with?" His heart skipped a beat. "What does that mean?" The woman finally stepped into the dim light fully, her face softening for the first time. "You think we're just people, just some shadowy organization trying to control your life. But the truth is, we're much more than that. And so are you." Suddenly, the weight of her words hit him. He felt a sinking sensation in his stomach, but he was falling into a deep abyss with no way of stopping. "What do you mean, so are you?" The woman's eyes were intense now, almost piercing. "You've been part of this from the very beginning. You just didn't know it. Your past, your family, your lineage, everything about you has been leading to this moment. You're not just a random man. You've been groomed for something bigger." The tall man chuckled darkly. "Your name, your history, it all connects. You don't know it yet, but you have a role to play in what's coming. A role that will shape the future." His head was spinning. He couldn't make sense of any of it. His life had always been so normal. He had never asked for any of this. Why him? What could he possibly have that they wanted? "You're one of us," the woman said softly. "Your whole life has been a preparation for this moment, for the choices you're about to make." A feeling of disbelief washed over him. Was he hearing this right? His mind raced, trying to process the impossible. But before he could say anything else, a sudden noise from behind him made him freeze. A low, metallic clink echoed in the warehouse, and the sound of footsteps grew closer. He turned just in time to see someone step into the light. It was a familiar face, someone he thought he had left behind long ago. His heart dropped. It was her, the woman from the plane. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a man he recognized, someone from his past he never expected to see again. His old boss, the one he thought had disappeared, gone without a trace. The one who had set everything in motion years ago. The man's voice was chilling as he addressed him. "You didn't think you'd be able to escape, did you? You were always meant to be here, at this moment. Now we all have a choice to make. The real game is just beginning." A flood of emotions surged through the man, confusion, rage, fear. But above it all, there was one realization that stood out. He wasn't just a pawn. He was a part of something far bigger than he could ever have imagined. And now it was too late to turn back. But as the final twist unfolded, he heard a faint sound, a click, followed by a rush of wind. The ground beneath him trembled, and a blinding light erupted from nowhere, casting everything into pure white chaos. And then, everything went silent. When the light faded, the man found himself standing alone in the dark, the warehouse empty, the figures gone. The world around him had shifted once again. The only thing left was the haunting question, what now? The man stood there in the eerie silence, his mind struggling to make sense of everything that had just happened. His body was still buzzing with the aftermath of that bright flash, and the emptiness around him felt suffocating. The warehouse, once a place of shadow and uncertainty, was now just a hollow shell. The people, the figures who had surrounded him moments ago, were gone. The man couldn't understand how everything had vanished so quickly. He had expected a confrontation, an answer, maybe even a resolution. Instead, he was left alone, standing in a space that felt colder than it ever had before. What did this all mean? What had he been a part of? The woman on the plane, the strange group, the cryptic messages, his mysterious past. All of it felt like a puzzle he had never asked to solve, but one that had consumed him nonetheless. Was it some kind of twisted game? Or was there more to it? More than he could ever comprehend. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His eyes scanned the warehouse, and as the moments passed, a subtle sense of clarity began to settle in. The feeling of being watched had never really left him, and now, even though the figures were gone, that sense was still present. He couldn't escape this world they had pulled him into, even if he tried. He was part of something much larger than he could have imagined, something that had been waiting for him to understand. The stillness around him seemed to heighten the weight of the situation. Everything that had happened had led him here. This moment, this empty warehouse, was the culmination of his actions, his choices. He'd made mistakes, sure, but had they been his mistakes? Or had he been manipulated from the very start? In that moment of quiet reflection, he realized something. It wasn't just about the people who had used him, or the game they had been playing. It was about how he could reclaim his agency. He could decide how this ended. He didn't have to be a pawn. He could take control. As his mind processed everything, he turned toward the door of the warehouse, stepping outside into the cold night air. His car, parked a short distance away, was still there, a reminder of the normal life he once had. But nothing would ever be the same again. No matter how far he tried to run, this shadowy world would follow him. He knew that now. The choice was his, whether to fight back, to dig deeper, to find the truth about who he really was, or to turn his back on it all and walk away. But as he approached his car, a sudden feeling swept over him, an overwhelming sense of finality. The mystery was no longer just about him. It was about something larger, something that stretched beyond the confines of this moment. The people who had played their part in this web of lies and secrets weren't done with him yet, and the world he had thought he understood had shifted in ways he couldn't even predict. His hand gripped the door handle, but before he could open it, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound was jarring in the quiet of the night, and he fumbled to pull it out. His eyes went straight to the screen, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a message, an encrypted text, the same type he'd received before, only this one was different. It read, "We know where you are. It's time to choose." The message sent a chill down his spine, and his mind raced. Who was watching him now? Was it them, the people who had controlled the strings this whole time, or was it someone else entirely? He didn't have the answers. But the reality of the situation hit him like a hammer. His choices, the ones he thought he could make for himself, were no longer his to make. The game, whatever it was, had never really been in his hands. As he stood in the cold, staring down at the phone in his hand, something clicked. The truth didn't always come in easy answers. It wasn't neat, it wasn't simple. Sometimes it was messy, hidden beneath layers of deception. But that didn't mean it wasn't worth seeking. He felt a shift within himself, a quiet resolve growing. He wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. He would make his own